My name is Laura Podzikowski, and I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of Kansas in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. How did I get into science? That's kind of a good question. I guess when I think back to my trajectory when I was younger, really quite young, everyone would have thought that I probably would have been a creative writer. I used to enter a lot of writing contests and win. You know, they would make my little tiny little short stories when I was in elementary school into plays at high school. That was one of the programs they did. So I was kind of on that creative writing path. But I had some really good science and biology teachers in high school, and I was exceptionally good at math. So I think that on some level, that trajectory was always within the realm of possibility for me. It just wasn't something that people would have necessarily thought I would have done. I didn't really get into science until college. I started off as an English major. And I guess part of the reason I decided not to do English as a major and to switch to biology was twofold. It was in part because I didn't like how much you had to, I love reading, but I didn't like how much you had to read for class. If you can just write creatively, that's one thing, but the amount that I had to read other writings and critique them in class kind of took something away from how fun reading was for me. So I didn't really want to do that. But I also happened to take a non-majors environmental science class my first semester, and it was the first time I learned about a lot of these large global change issues that we were having. And it just was kind of fascinating for me. I just remember thinking that was the biggest thing that was going to be facing my generation. And we did this, and the reason I decided to actually go into science was because we did one field trip where we went out to this bog in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and I got to measure pitcher plants. We measured the opening of the pitcher plants, and then we took that data and we compared it to a study that looked at basically how wide the opening was to see how much nitrogen pollution was actually getting into the bog. And I just remember thinking that was just such a fun process that I wanted to major in science. But I remember being really not sure about what I wanted to do. I was surprised by how no one really tells you what to do in college or in life in general. So when I went to talk to my environmental science teacher about changing majors, she's like, "Oh yeah, that would be a really good fit for you." And I was like, "Why would no one tell me that that would be a good fit?" But I guess that was the first time I realized in life that sometimes people aren't just going to tell you what you need to do in your life, that you kind of have to ask, because no one's going to give you your path for you. You kind of have to take that journey yourself. So I'm actually from Detroit, Michigan. Actually, I grew up right on the border of Detroit. I'm from a town called Ferndale, Michigan, and it literally borders Detroit with 8 Mile. It's a really weird place to grow up because it's I never know how to describe it, but it kind of feels like I grew up on the border of extreme poverty and extreme wealth, and I didn't really fit in either of those categories. And also, it's just also an odd place to grow up because my great-grandfather was the fire chief there. My parents never moved more than a mile away from where they grew up. So I grew up in this very city environment, but all of my extended family lived there, and that was really normal. I think that's really traditional for places like Detroit and Chicago and some of these cities to have neighborhoods within the city where entire families just kind of stay there. Growing up there was kind of interesting because, yeah, obviously it was somewhat more urban than, for instance, I went to a private school for college, and that was a bit of a culture shock. And by a bit, I mean it was a complete and utter culture shock for me because, it wasn't necessarily the type of place where you're expected to go to college. A lot of my high school classmates didn't, so to end up on this path is a little bit not unique per se, but not necessarily expected of somebody where I'm from. So yeah, it was it's kind of an odd place to grow up, and people don't really know where it is here, right? So then how did I end up actually in Kansas? It was kind of a long journey. So I did my undergrad at Kalamazoo College, which is a private school in Michigan. And it was kind of perfect for me because it was really small, but it was also really eye-opening for me because I'd never experienced kind of that private school culture. I was a public school student in high school, and they're very different in like the way that you do school, and the culture is very different, but it was very like formative for me. I honestly don't think I would be here if I didn't do that private school education, because I just kind of like got such a great foundation from it. But I had to like work really hard, like like really hard in undergrad. It was like incredibly challenging for me. I didn't really realize that like we didn't have as many resources as some of these other kids who were coming from private schools. It was like really shocking the first like bio lab that I took, because I remember we were doing DNA extractions, and like we never did anything like that in high school, and like all the kids around my table were like, yeah, I've been like doing these since like my junior year, and like one of the girls was like, oh, I've been doing DNA extractions like freshman year of high school, and I was like, what's the pipette? Like, I don't know anything, I've never done any of this. So like labs are really stressful for me. They were so stressful, which is kind of funny because I think people wouldn't necessarily think that now. It just takes practice, and I just didn't have that opportunity when I was younger. So I had to like work really hard, and I wasn't really sure that this was a good fit for me after like college. I think I was a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for? I had a little bit of like insecurity about like going into science. A lot of this like work I think takes a lot of practice, and I think sometimes not to like devalue, but I think when you're younger sometimes you don't realize how much experience and work it takes to actually get there. So then after I took a few years off and I did a master's, and I did like a half master's half thesis program, and I decided to do a thesis in the middle of the program, which was definitely the harder way to do it. But I think I realized then that like I just really liked the process of science. And then I worked 2 technician jobs before I decided to come back to do a PhD. So for me, it took like a long time for me basically to convince myself that I could do this more than anything else. And I'm not sure why that was the case, but I think that's not abnormal for a lot of people. And sometimes it takes a little bit longer for you to figure out what you want and to get there, but I think that's totally fine. I guess if I were to summarize my research, I would say that I am interested in how the living and non-living systems interact. And that's kind of what I've been studying for my entire career. I've stayed in one system. I started in streams, and I've just been progressively working through drier and drier systems. Like I started working in streams, and then ephemeral wetlands, which are like wetlands that dry down every single year. And then I worked in forests, and now I'm working in prairies, which are kind of the driest of all the systems I've worked in. And I'm just really interested in how things like plants and different species of plants interact with things that are non-living, like water, or, well, I wouldn't say soils per se, but sometimes chemical nutrients, so things like carbon or nitrogen, which you probably heard about, that these plants need. And so that's my goal in my research, is to study how different species of plants interact with the non-living system.